And away we go. So we've looked at the causes of World War II. We've looked at the actual fighting of World War II on a number of fronts in Europe. We'll look at what's happening in Asia a bit later. And so now, wrapping it up, let's look at the effects, the impacts of World War II in Europe. And so, what I'm hoping y'all get out of this is an understanding overall of the political, social, and economic impacts that World War II had in Europe, that you gain an understanding for the motivations of the actors, and therefore analyze how that's going to result in those political, social, and economic impacts. And one of the things definitely here is how this all is going to lead to the Cold War. And for the HL students, what we will be looking at for the last HL topics are Western Europe from 1945 to 2000, as well as Russia and Eastern Europe in the same time period. And so what happens in those two areas and the paths that they follow is going to be a result of this, right? All of these things that we're discussing and the motivations of these actors. So one of the purposes here is to develop this foundation so that you will then better be able to explain and understand the changes that occurred in these areas in the post-war period. Okay, and so we begin. World War II ended. You know, we're not still fighting World War II. And so the German Instrument of Surrender was ratified on May 8th, 1945. And one of the things, we'll talk about this in greater detail later on in the video, is they wanted to prevent the stabbed in the back myth that led to the collapse of the Weimar Republic, as you guys know a ton of stuff about this, and the rise of Hitler. So essentially, this German Instrument of Surrender was to create a more stable going forth of Germany, and this is an attempt to learn from the mistakes that they made with the Treaty of Versailles. And this instrument of surrender and World War II is going to result in large-scale political, social, and economic changes. So before we get started, there's some overall things to consider and remember as we sort of pile on the information. Most of the European countries who participated in World War II experienced high levels of destruction, as did Asia. We have massive destruction of homes. One of the biggest things that happens, of course, during the fighting of the war is the targeting of civilians and homes, one of the biggest things. And so we have a lot of people who are homeless, and countries are going to need to try to deal with these situations moving forward. Destruction of industry. So industry, especially in Europe, is the backbone of the economy. And so there's going to need to be an addressing of the fact that there is no industry, or there was massive destruction of industry and therefore unemployment. Massive destruction of infrastructure. And so that includes things like roads, bridges, water pipes, sewage systems, governmental infrastructure that, did things like taxes or post office, all of this stuff. So infrastructure is going to be big. So when we look at these three things, essentially, huge portions of the countries are going to have to be rebuilt from the ground up. We have millions and millions of lives lost because of terror bombing, because of lack of food, etc. And there are millions of refugees. Refugees because people lost their homes, but refugees also because people were forced to move during this time period. And so, unlike World War I, there was no peace settlement between all of the participants. You don't have anything like the Paris Peace Conference. So you don't have this sort of like uniform attempt to deal with the situation. And one of the reasons for this is because there we have a large amount of distrust between the West and communist governments. There is a fundamental disagreement ideologically, and that means that there's going to be a fundamental disagreement onto how to proceed forth. So instead, what you have are many small separate peace treaties. And so one of the first places we're going to begin to understand how these treaties came about and all of this, all good stuff, is with the Yalta Conference, which was held in early February 1945. And so basically here, what we have is Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin getting together to discuss what Europe is going to look like and what role each government is going to take in creating this new Europe. There was a recognition that in no way could they go back to the way things had been prior to World War II because, well, World War II resulted. And because we had so many countries that had been invaded and occupied by Germany, and then so many countries that had allied with Germany, there's going to need to be a massive restructuring of the political systems. And so the UK wanted democratic elections in Eastern and Central Europe. The US wanted the Soviet Union to enter the Pacific War. For the most part, the US kind of held a maintaining war in a way in the Pacific. They fought against Japan, but the majority of their resources and attention was focused on Germany. After the European War, then they would bring their resources to bear in the Pacific. And so the US didn't want to take on the Pacific War alone. So they're asking Soviet Union to enter the Pacific War because, of course, the Soviet Union shares a long border with Japan. And then the Soviet Union shares a crazy long border with China, which Japan had invaded and was waging war. And then, of course, ever since the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, Japan and Russia had been fighting for influence in Asia. So this would be strategically beneficial for the Soviet Union. And so the U.S. asks them to participate. The Soviet Union is asking and wanting a sphere of influence in Eastern and Central Europe. This was essentially about creating buffer states so that the situation that occurred in World War II with direct invasion into Russian lands would not happen again. And as stated before, they're discussing the reorganization of Europe. And politically, that is the type of government, as well as politically in terms of redrawing borders that may need to be redrawn. As a result of the Yalta Conference, they agreed on zones of occupation for each within Eastern Europe and especially within Germany. Restoration of pre-war governments. So all of these countries that had been invaded, like Denmark and Belgium, Netherlands, Norway, would have their governments in exile returned. France was not to have the restoration of that previous government because that was the government that was in collaboration with Hitler. Poland was a special case because of Russia's interest, Stalin's direct interest in Poland. We'll talk about that a little later. And Romania and Bulgaria had quote unquote revolutions during World War II, which meant that the governments which had been in collaboration with Hitler were overthrown and new governments were put in, so those new governments would not be replaced. Repatriation of soldiers. We have huge numbers of people that had been captured. So Italians in North Africa, Germans in Eastern Europe, et cetera, et cetera. And so how they were going to bring these people back home. And they all agreed on that there was going to be an unconditional surrender of Germany. So it wasn't going to be an armistice. It was going to be a recognition of Germany from the very beginning that they lost. And this also meant that there were going to be no single brain fart. That there was going to be unilateral. Everybody would sign a treaty or agree with that Germany had lost, rather than just individual ones. They agreed that following the war, that there would be demilitarization of Germany. So this was essentially kind of like a shade of World War I, trying to remove the military threat that Germany posed to the rest of Europe. There would also be a denazification of Germany, that is a complete destruction of the institutions, structure, ideology that Nazis had put in place, and also a removal of Nazis from participating in the public life, in the government, political life of Germany. And Germany, they agreed that Germany would pay reparations, and part of those reparations would come in the form of forced labor in the Soviet Union. And this is where the Poland comes in terms of this new government. The Soviet Union gets to keep the portion of Poland seized in 1939. Essentially, the Soviet Union comes out as a big winner. They're not punished in any way for the non-aggression pact, and Poland suffers. And so basically, Russia, the Soviet Union, Stalin was in a really strong position because his army, the Red Army, was needed to push westward into Europe and kind of capture the lands that Germany had previously captured. And we have the establishment of the United Nations, again, shades of World War I. The idea here is that they learned from the mistakes that they had made with the creation of the League of Nations, and so they weren't going to have strong actors pull out of the United Nations the way that the US, Germany, and the Soviet Union did not participate in the League of Nations until essentially, well, the US never did, but near the end. So the idea was to create a strong organization from the very beginning to provide that diplomacy and kind of keep people's behavior in check, with the Soviet Union participating in the United Nations from the get-go. And so the Soviet Union was to enter the war with Japan 3 months after German surrender. As we'll see later, that doesn't really come to happen. And basically the idea here was give the Soviet Union some time to pull themselves together and actually mobilize the army eastward, right? Remember, the Soviet Union is absolutely gigantic, and the Red Army had pushed significantly into Central Europe at this point in time. And so they were very extended. And then, of course, they also agreed that there would be punishment of the Nazi war criminals. And they agreed that they would occupy these liberated states while they set up democratic governments. And so this was really, really vague. There was no real explanation about what this occupation was going to be like, and nor what this democratic state thing was going to be like.